The air in the courtroom was thick, almost suffocating. I could hear the rustling of papers, the faint tapping of a pen against wood, but mostly I heard my own heartbeat. It pounded in my ears, steady and loud, as if warning me of what was coming. I sat still, hands folded tightly in my lap, trying to keep them from shaking. The judge had barely looked at me since I walked in. That wasn't a good sign. Judge Lawson shifted in his chair, finally lifting his gaze. His eyes were sharp, unreadable, like he had already made up his mind long before I had even opened my mouth. "Miss Leavitt," he said, his voice steady, controlled. "This court does not take kindly to wasted time." I swallowed hard. Wasted time. I had spent weeks preparing for this. I wasn't even supposed to be here today. This wasn't my case to argue. But when Mr. Harper, the lead attorney, got food poisoning this morning, I was the only one left. I thought I had done well. I thought I had held my own. Clearly, Judge Lawson didn't agree. He exhaled through his nose, slow and deliberate. "You stepped in without proper authorization. This is a legal proceeding, not a classroom exercise." His fingers tapped against the bench. "I'm issuing a fine of $10,000. The words hit like a slap. The room seemed to shrink around me. $10,000. That was more than I made in a year as a legal assistant. More than I could ever afford. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. My mind raced, searching for something, anything to say. I turned my head slightly, just enough to see Mr. Calloway, the opposing counsel, smirking from across the room. He leaned back in his chair, completely at ease. I could almost hear what he was thinking. I had walked in here like I belonged, like I was something more than just an assistant, and now I was paying the price. Judge Lawson reached for his gavel. "This matter is settled." Panic surged in my chest. No, it couldn't end like this. Not like this. My hands gripped the edge of the table. "Your Honor!" The gavel slammed down. The sound of the gavel echoed in my ears like a door slamming shut. For a split second, I just sat there, frozen, my brain struggling to catch up with what had just happened. $10,000. That wasn't just a fine. That was a warning. A message. I glanced at Mr. Calloway again. He hadn't stopped smirking. He didn't even bother to hide it. To him, this wasn't just a legal proceeding. It was a game, and I had just lost in front of everyone. Judge Lawson started shuffling his papers, already moving on to the next case. As if this was over. As if I was supposed to stand up, walk out, and accept the fact that my entire future had just been shattered in less than a minute. My hands clenched into fists. No, this wasn't right. I had spent too many nights studying case law, too many hours preparing, too much time fighting for this moment. And I knew that I hadn't done anything wrong. I forced myself to sit up straighter. "Your Honor, with all due respect, I challenge your ruling." The words were out before I could second-guess them. The room went still. Even the court clerk, who had been typing away without much interest, stopped and looked up. Judge Lawson's hand froze mid-motion, his fingers still gripping the paper he had been about to sign. Slowly, he turned his gaze back to me, and for the first time he actually looked at me. Not as an inconvenience. Not as some young assistant who had overstepped, but as a problem that hadn't gone away like he expected. "On what grounds?" His voice was quieter now, but somehow heavier. I swallowed, my pulse hammering against my ribs. I had to get this right. I had one shot. I took a slow breath. "Precedent, Your Honor." In Mason v. Grant, 2012, the judge dismissed sanctions against an unlicensed legal assistant under similar circumstances. My voice was steadier than I expected, but my hands were still shaking under the table. Mr. Calloway let out a small chuckle. "Nice try, Miss Leavitt, but you're not a lawyer. You don't have standing to challenge a ruling." A few people in the courtroom murmured in agreement. I could feel their eyes on me, waiting for me to back down. But I had already started, and I wasn't going to stop now. I turned to Calloway, meeting his gaze head-on. "I don't have to be a lawyer to know the law." Judge Lawson leaned back in his chair, folding his hands in front of him. He didn't say anything for a long moment, just watched me, like he was trying to figure out if I was bluffing. Finally, he spoke. "Continue." The weight of the courtroom pressed down on me. Every breath felt too loud. Every shift of a chair or rustle of paper seemed to echo. Judge Lawson was watching me now, really watching me, his expression unreadable. My hands curled into fists beneath the table to keep them from shaking. I had his attention, but that didn't mean I had won. Not yet. I swallowed hard. I had to choose my words carefully. One misstep, and I'd lose everything. Your Honor, I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. In Mason v. Grant, the court ruled that an unlicensed assistant stepping in for an absent attorney does not constitute unauthorized practice of law when they are operating under direct supervision. I glanced at Mr. Calloway, who was already shaking his head, a smirk tugging at his lips. If the argument is that I shouldn't have spoken in court, then by that logic, every paralegal who has ever filed a motion under instruction should also be fined. Lawson exhaled through his nose, considering this. Calloway, however, let out a soft chuckle. Miss Leavitt, you're making a classic mistake. You're comparing filing a motion to presenting oral arguments before a judge. That's not the same thing. I didn't look at him. I couldn't afford to. I understand that, Your Honor. But what I did today wasn't arguing. It was clarifying points already made in my attorney's filings. If I hadn't spoken, I wouldn't have been doing anything different than if I had written a note and handed it to Mr. Harper to read out loud. Judge Lawson tilted his head slightly, tapping his fingers against the bench. He wasn't dismissing me outright. He was thinking. That was good. Calloway sighed, clearly losing patience. This is ridiculous. We're wasting time. She broke the rules. End of story. I finally turned to look at him. Mr. Calloway, if we're talking about wasting time, let's consider this. This entire hearing happened today because my firm's lead attorney fell ill. If you had any real objections, you could have requested a continuance. You didn't. Calloway's jaw tensed, but he said nothing. I turned back to the judge. Your Honor, I stepped in because there was no other option. If I hadn't spoken, this hearing would have ended in a default ruling against my client simply because of an unexpected illness. That isn't justice. The room was silent. My pulse pounded in my ears. Then, Judge Lawson leaned forward. Miss Leavitt, do you know who argued Mason v. Grant? I hesitated, confused. That wasn't what I had expected him to ask. Yes, Your Honor. It was Daniel Leavitt. Something flickered across his face, something I couldn't quite place. Then he sat back and exhaled slowly. I knew him. The words hung in the air between us. Judge Lawson's voice had been calm, steady, but there was something underneath it, something I couldn't quite place. My heart pounded in my chest as I studied his face, searching for any sign of what he was thinking. I knew him. I had spent my whole life hearing my father's name spoken in courtrooms, in law offices, in quiet conversations between attorneys who either admired or feared him. But I had never heard it like that before. The judge tapped his fingers against the bench, his expression unreadable. Your father was one of the sharpest legal minds I ever met, he said finally. Brilliant strategist. Impossible to shake. Always 2 steps ahead. He paused. I argued against him once. He won. I swallowed. I had never heard that story before. Judge Lawson shifted slightly in his seat. I assume he's the one who taught you? I nodded. My voice felt stuck in my throat, but I forced the words out anyway. He taught me everything. Lawson studied me for a long moment. Then he sat back, exhaling slowly. That explains a lot. Mr. Calloway let out a scoff from across the room. Your Honor, I fail to see how Miss Leavitt's father is relevant to this discussion. Lawson turned his gaze to Calloway, and for the first time since this hearing had started, I saw something in his expression that made even Calloway hesitate. It's relevant, the judge said simply. Then he looked back at me. Miss Leavitt, you've made some interesting arguments here today. But I have to wonder, why aren't you in law school? The question caught me off guard. I opened my mouth, then closed it again. I had been preparing to fight the fine, to defend my actions, but I hadn't been expecting that. I hesitated, glancing down at my hands. I never thought I was ready. The courtroom was so quiet I could hear the distant hum of the air conditioning. Lawson didn't take his eyes off me. That's not what I asked. I asked why. I could feel my pulse in my throat. I had spent my whole life trying to live up to my father's legacy, studying his cases, memorizing his arguments, pushing myself harder every time I felt like I wasn't enough. But the idea of stepping into a law school classroom, of officially trying to follow in his footsteps, had always felt impossible. I forced myself to meet the judge's eyes. Because I was afraid I'd fail. Something in his expression shifted. He nodded slowly. Then he did something I never expected. "I'll sponsor your application personally." The words didn't register at first. I just stared at Judge Lawson, waiting for him to say something else, to explain, to tell me I had misheard. But he didn't. He just sat there, watching me, waiting. I could hear my own breathing. Too loud. Too uneven. No one else in the room made a sound. Even Calloway, who had spent the entire hearing trying to tear me down, was silent. Finally, I found my voice. You want to sponsor me?" Lawson nodded. "Yes." I gripped the edge of the table, grounding myself. "Why?" His expression didn't change. "Because I see potential." He leaned forward slightly. "Because I saw your father in the same position once, standing exactly where you are now, being underestimated by people who thought he didn't belong. And because I don't believe in letting talent go to waste." A lump formed in my throat. I tried to swallow it down, but it wouldn't go away. Calloway shifted in his seat, his chair creaking. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this is highly unusual." Lawson turned to him. "What's unusual about recognizing someone with an exceptional legal mind?" Calloway hesitated, then scoffed. "She's an assistant. She doesn't have a law degree. She doesn't even have the right to be speaking in this courtroom." Lawson didn't blink. "And yet she just argued you into silence." Calloway's jaw tightened. His hands curled around the armrests of his chair. "You can't just decide she belongs in law school because she made a few good points." Lawson exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "I didn't decide anything. She did." He looked back at me. "The question is, Miss Leavitt, what are you going to do about it?" I felt the weight of every eye in the room pressing down on me. My entire body was shaking, but for the first time, it wasn't from fear. It was from something else. I straightened in my chair. "I'm going to prove you right." A slow smile tugged at the corner of Lawson's mouth. "Good." He turned back to his bench, picking up his pen. "Then let's start by overturning that fine." The words hung in the air, heavier than I expected. Overturning the fine. Just like that. My mind struggled to keep up. One moment, I had been staring down the reality of losing $10,000. Money I didn't have. Money I could never afford. The next, Judge Lawson was wiping it away as if it had never happened. I should have felt relief. But instead, all I felt was a strange mix of disbelief and something else I couldn't quite name. Calloway shot up from his seat, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Your Honor, you can't just overturn the fine. It was a proper ruling." Lawson didn't look at him. "It was an unnecessary one." He continued writing, his pen gliding smoothly across the paper. Miss Leavitt's presence here was not unlawful, nor was her participation disruptive. She did not practice law. She clarified facts. The fine was issued prematurely. Calloway let out a sharp breath, his hands pressing against the table. "This is absurd. You're setting a dangerous precedent." Lawson finally looked up. "Oh, and what precedent would that be?" Calloway hesitated. "That anyone can walk into a courtroom and argue a case as long as they sound convincing enough." Lawson sighed, setting his pen down. "Mr. Calloway, do you really believe that's what happened here?" Calloway's jaw clenched. "It doesn't matter what I believe. The law is clear. The law is also flexible." Lawson cut him off. "And it makes exceptions for those who earn them." Calloway's nostrils flared, but he said nothing. He knew as well as I did that arguing with a sitting judge was pointless. The ruling had been made. I felt my fingers loosen their grip on the table, my breath coming easier. But before I could fully process what had just happened, Lawson turned back to me. "Miss Leavitt," he said, his voice steady measured. "This court owes you something." My throat tightened. "What?" He gestured toward the empty space beside me, the place where Mr. Harper should have been standing. "You prepared for this hearing. You stepped up when no one else could. You built an argument strong enough to hold against opposition. And yet, the court would have dismissed you without a second thought. That was a mistake." I stared at him, unsure of what to say. Lawson leaned forward slightly. "I'm offering you a chance to correct that mistake." The room was too quiet. I could feel the weight of Calloway's glare, the curiosity of the other spectators, the steady pulse of my own heartbeat in my ears. Finally, I found my voice. What kind of chance? Lawson smiled faintly. A test. I blinked. A test. Yes. He folded his hands. I want you to argue a case. A real case. In this courtroom. The breath left my lungs all at once. Calloway let out a laugh, sharp, bitter. You're joking. Lawson didn't even look at him. I don't joke about the law. I swallowed hard. But I'm not a lawyer. You will be. The words sent a shiver down my spine. Not if. Not maybe. You will be. I took a slow breath. When? Lawson's eyes gleamed. Tomorrow morning. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, my mind raced through everything that could go wrong. I wasn't a lawyer. I had no license, no official standing in any courtroom. And yet, in just a few hours, I would be standing before a judge, arguing a real case. When the sun finally rose, I sat at my desk, surrounded by open books and scattered notes. My hands trembled as I flipped through the case file Judge Lawson had given me. It wasn't some minor dispute. It was a landlord-tenant case involving an eviction. A real family. Real consequences. I had no room for mistakes. The courthouse felt different that morning. People moved with purpose, their voices blending into a low hum of legal chatter. I gripped my folder so tightly my knuckles turned white. Each step toward the courtroom felt heavier than the last. Inside, I spotted Judge Lawson already seated at the bench. Calloway stood by the opposing table, his arms crossed, watching me like a hawk. Of course, he was here. He wouldn't miss the chance to watch me fail. I took my seat at the counsel's table. My heart pounded, so loudly I was sure everyone could hear it. Judge Lawson tapped his gavel once. Miss Leavitt, are you ready? No. Not even close. I straightened my back. Yes, Your Honor. He nodded and turned to the other side. Mr. Calloway, you may proceed. Calloway smirked as he stepped forward. Your Honor, let's be clear about what's happening here. We have an unlicensed legal assistant attempting to argue a case in open court. This isn't just unorthodox. It's absurd. I clenched my fists under the table. Lawson didn't react. Noted. Proceed with your argument. Calloway exhaled sharply before turning to the courtroom. This is a simple matter. The landlord had every right to issue an eviction. The tenant has failed to pay rent for 3 months. There are no legal grounds to dispute the removal. He turned toward me, his smirk widening. Unless Miss Leavitt has some miraculous legal theory she'd like to present. All eyes shifted to me. I took a breath, steadying myself. Your Honor, opposing counsel has presented the facts, but he left out one critical detail. The lease agreement contains an emergency hardship clause that prevents eviction if the tenant can prove financial distress due to medical circumstances. I turned to the judge, pushing forward a document. The tenant's wife was hospitalized for surgery during the 3-month period in question. The hospital bills were overwhelming. He submitted proof of hardship, which the landlord ignored. Calloway scoffed. Irrelevant. Hardship clauses require immediate notification. He failed to notify the landlord within the required time frame. I met his gaze. That would be true if he hadn't sent an email requesting an extension, which the landlord never responded to. I held up another document. Phone records show multiple calls made to the property manager. None were returned. The room went still. Judge Lawson reviewed the documents, his expression unreadable. Then he turned to Calloway. Mr. Calloway, does the landlord have a documented response to these requests? Calloway's smirk faltered. No, Your Honor. Lawson set the papers down. Then it seems Miss Leavitt has made a compelling argument. A hush fell over the courtroom. My heart pounded, so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. Then Lawson turned back to me. Miss Leavitt, what remedy are you seeking? I swallowed. A dismissal of the eviction. The judge nodded slowly, then picked up his gavel. Eviction denied. The gavel struck the bench. And just like that, I had won my first case. For a moment, I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The sound of the gavel still echoed in my ears, the weight of Judge Lawson's ruling settling into the silence of the courtroom. I had won. I had actually won. Then everything rushed back at once. The whispered murmurs from the gallery, The scrape of Calloway's chair as he stiffly sat down, the rapid beating of my heart pounding in my chest. Judge Lawson looked at me, his expression calm but firm. Miss Leavitt approached the bench. I forced myself to stand, my legs unsteady as I walked forward. The courtroom felt larger than before, as if the air itself had shifted. When I stopped in front of him, Lawson studied me for a long moment. Then, he leaned forward slightly. How did that feel? I swallowed hard, like I belonged here. A small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Good. Behind me, I could feel Calloway's glare burning into my back. He was angry, humiliated, but I didn't care. I had done what I came to do. Judge Lawson sat back in his chair. This court recognizes the dedication, skill, and composure you have demonstrated today. And while I cannot change the rules of the bar, I can do the next best thing. My pulse quickened. What do you mean? Lawson glanced at the clerk, who immediately retrieved a stack of papers and handed them to me. I looked down at them, my breath catching in my throat. An official recommendation from Judge Lawson himself. A recommendation for immediate acceptance into law school. My hands trembled as I flipped through the pages. I could barely process the words staring back at me. Calloway scoffed from behind me. This is ridiculous. She won one case. That doesn't make her a lawyer. Lawson turned his gaze toward him. No, it doesn't. But it proves that she will be. Calloway opened his mouth to argue but hesitated. He knew he had lost, and he hated it. I clutched the papers to my chest, my entire body buzzing with adrenaline, disbelief, and something I hadn't let myself feel in a long time. Hope. As I turned to leave, I caught one last look at the courtroom. The place where I had fought, where I had proved myself. I knew I would be back. But next time, I wouldn't just be standing at the table. Next time, I would be standing as a lawyer. Thank you for listening to another exciting story from VIP Vault. If you have enjoyed listening to the story, check out our videos here.